Welcome. Again, my name is Frederick Luis Aldama. I'm a professor here at The Ohio State University, and this was going to be our first module in our course, The Planetary Republic of Comics. This module, What is a Comic? Across the globe, we see how visual and verbal built fictional and non-fictional narratives, comic books, function as blueprints or designs to guide how we as readers co-create their story worlds. The choice of line or layout or color or phrase or angle of vision and much more guide readers in how we imagine character, setting, and theme. Each element in the making of the comic guides audiences in what we might consider to be a co-creation of story. As readers turn left to right, right to left, in the case of manga, or jump back from a splash page, or scans a page layout, the marks on the page guide them in how they fill in the blanks, how they imagine external and internal movement of body and mind, within what becomes fully imagined story worlds in this co-creative process. In this co-creative process, as our moves back and forth between the reading of verbal elements to the visual drawn elements, we make sense of the story. We perceive, interpret, and feel. That is, the visual and the verbal shaping devices used in the Planetary Republic of Comics make for a design, and each with its own distinctive blueprint, that guides us in our sense-making activities. However, they don't determine absolutely where we go with our thoughts and feelings as we read and view the comic. They guide, but still leave room for our imagination to fill in gaps with our own individual and idiosyncratic experiences, memories, and emotions. Creators of comics dedicate much of their day creating objects that establish an aesthetic that is located not in the comic book nor in the reader, but in the relationship, the relationality that the narrative blueprint establishes between the comic and the audience. In so doing, the creators draw and distill from, then use the shaping devices of comics to reconstruct a new reality we inhabit. The distillation and reconstruction of reality in the comic book format takes place in specifics of time and place, history, cultural, and political circumstances. For instance, the social, economic, and political circumstances for a 21st century creator like Frank Espinosa differ radically from that of a Milt Caniff. Likewise, the technological advances from paper to printing machinery and color types allow for a greater range of shaping devices used by an Espinosa and a Caniff. And so too does the object that's being recreated shift in time and place. In terms of simple demographics, the way the US looks today with Latinos as the majority minority is not the same as it did just after World War II or before World War II or during earlier moments in our history. The globe proper doesn't look the same. With global capitalism increasing the gap between the few haves and the many have-nots, many today risk decoupling from family and homelands in search of ways to survive. Comic book creators around the world can and do choose to recreate this reality and all other aspects of our material and cultural reality in their distilling and reconstructing in the making of their visual verbal shaped narratives. There are several ways we can begin to answer the question, what is a comic? One would be to continue to pursue a line of thought that discusses how comics reconstruct in different historical periods and from different regions of the world the impact of socioeconomic forces, colonialism, imperialism, global capitalism. Another would be to consider how comics as blueprints are built both to reconstruct this reality and to potentially open audience eyes, thoughts, and feelings about the world we inhabit. For the purpose of this module of the course, we will focus more on the latter. If considered within the arts generally, comic book fictional or factual narratives are a relatively recent phenomenon. While we see incipient instantiations in earlier epochs in the 18th century Hogarth and the 19th century with Topfer, for instance, it seems to have really come into its own in the 20th century. As a result, the field of its interpretation is likewise relatively new. Indeed, carrying the burden of it being identified in the U.S. as a juvenile narrative form for much of the 20th century, we really don't see a steady stream of scholarship on comic books till relatively recently. Today, we see scholars who seek to analyze comics strictly from their capacity to represent, and in this capacity to overturn ideas about humans and the world we inhabit. These studies include analysis of issues that gravitate around topics of race, class, gender, and sexuality. Other scholarly approaches seek to sleuth out how comics are built. Here, there are those who attend to the verbal shaping devices and others the visual. Within the scholarship that focuses on the visual shaping devices, there are many further divisions and specifications. For instance, practitioner-theorist Scott McCloud considers the importance of sequentiality, that a panel alone, even if it includes visual and verbal elements, does not a comic make, but rather that it is the placement of panels in sequence. Comics certainly are unique in the way they use both verbal and visual devices to give shape to their narratives. However, it appears to be the case that the visuals are the dominant in comic book narratives. So where in alphabetic narratives the artistry comes in the way an author chooses words and syntax to complicate person and scene, the narrative acrobatics in comics usually happens at the level of the visual. That is to say, we consider comic books to be a specific assemblage of those building blocks taken from reality and turned into a geometry of story. Comic book creators reconstruct the building blocks of reality in their particularized assemblage of geometric forms. Creators that make up the World Republic of Comics use visual shaping devices to geometrize their story. They do so to energize elements of plot, theme, and character. It is their choice of panel, layout, line, color, perspective, object shape, balloon shape, and placement, lettering, and gutter size and width, among others, that we consider to be the fundamentals in the making of narratives that move and in the creating of protagonists that pop. Indeed, practitioner scholars like Matt Madden and Jessica Abel also emphasize the central importance of the visual in comics. For Madden and Abel, comic book narrative art is drawing words and writing pictures. For Madden and Abel, it is the careful use of visuals in the creating of page-wide compositions that bring the story to life. Others have identified specific visual grammars of comics. For instance, Pascal Lefebvre focuses our attention on shaping devices of the word balloon. For Lefebvre, this allows the creator to combine the visual, line thickness and shape, as well as font style, for instance, with the text, speech or thought, not possible in other storytelling formats. For Lefebvre, it is the visual sequencing, the layout, the speech balloon placement that educate the reader in how to make sense of the narrative. And for Karin Kukkonen, the visuals of comics allow them to simultaneously represent time and place in one perceptual moment. For Jared Gardner, it is the drawn line that forms the basic diction and syntax of comics. For Gardner, the line of the frame, the gutter, around dialogue and thought balloons, and of the lettering create boundaries that guide our meaning-making processes. Line work, like all the other visual elements, gives shape to the story as well as convey its content. They can be used to describe a landscape or a character in one gestaltic blow, but the way they are drawn gives particular stylistic shape to the landscape and character. The style of the visuals conveys the mood of a scene at the same time that they describe a character's physiology, movement, and action. There are many visual elements one must attend to when identifying the way comic book creators give unique shape to fictional and non-fictional narratives around the world. Within each country's comic book tradition, readers have come to identify how the visual grammar conveys, by convention, certain meaning. In mainstream European and US comics, the jagged lined balloon or panel suggest a shift in emotion or a spatial temporal mode, for instance. And the way any given word or phrase is drawn, font style, size, thickness, and angle can and does add to meaning, including even that of sound. In this sense, the visual language of comics springs from a universal grammar, fixed 2D images in sequence, inking, coloring, perspective whereby the visual is the dominant in the conveying of the story. However, its expression is idiomatic. Comics spring from a shared universal grammar, but each is realized differently depending on the soil that it is grown in. For instance, in Japanese manga, there is the use of the gutter, but they are typically much larger than in the US or European comics. This and other conventions not only put certain constraints that lead to different creative results in manga, but the gutter can also mean differently to its use on other national traditions. For instance, the widening of a horizontal gap in manga indicates a change of scene. The visual devices used to geometrize the narrative are numerous. They help create the pace, tempo, and rhythm of the viewing experience. They guide our thoughts and feelings. They guide our meaning-making mechanisms. And while comic book creators use visual grammar conventions the world over, they are also constantly looking for new ways to enrich the experience we have when encountering comic book narratives. Finally, it is our sense that the visual devices in comics are the story as much as, if not more than, textual narrative is the story. The idiosyncratic way each of the creators that make up the World Republic of Comics uses the visuals reflects their unique style and worldview.